This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody, welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale, I'm a writer and critic, and today I'm going to be talking to a much better writer, Mark Harris. He is the author of Five Came Home, Pictures from the Revolution, and his new biography of the director Mike NIchols, which has been a huge success as well. Please remember, if you enjoy the podcast, to like it and subscribe and spread the word as far wide as you can, because otherwise you're just being selfish. I mean, this is a very niche podcast, people who like reading books about cinema, so the more people who would be happy and would get something out of it, that know about it, the better it would be. So thanks very much if you can do that. You could also follow me on Twitter if you're so inclined, at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
No, so Scenes is the British edition. For some reason, when it was published in 2008, the UK publisher insisted that nobody knew what pictures meant in England, and I've since talked to a whole bunch of English people who've said that's not true.
Absolutely.
And so to this day, people think that I wrote two similarly titled books, but they're identical.
Yeah, no, I did that thing of flipping between Amazon in the UK and Amazon in America, trying to work out which one was the definitive, but they're identical, so that's great.
They're identical. I don't understand it. I suppose it's too late to fix it, and nobody in England will care anyway. So, but it's just a strange little thing.
Yeah, we used to use the word pictures as a all the time. Going to the pictures was going to the flicks, going to the pictures. You know, it's perfectly understandable.
It's slightly archaic now, but it's slightly archaic in the US now. So, it's,
Yeah.
I don't understand it.
How did you start writing? Do you remember what your first review was? Did you work as a critic first? What was your introduction?
Yeah, I started out after college in the late 80s as an entertainment journalist, writing primarily about television, because that was the job I could get. Reviewing TV. This was obviously pre-internet, so for any place that would have me, which was not many places, and sometimes just one of my first jobs was just writing listings for a syndication service that gave TV listings to newspapers that couldn't afford their own TV critics. So it wasn't criticism. It was tonight on Full House, the girls get a surprise. But
do you remember what the surprise was?
I don't remember what the surprise, but I do remember that sentence and writing it and really feeling like, well, I hope I've just hit bottom as an entertainment journalist.
That's the sentence that is your
after
marker.
This, it's really just like, addressing envelopes. I guess that's writing too. And then in 1990, when Entertainment Weekly launched in the US, I got a job there as a staff writer and started to write about television and also to be sent out to report stories and do interviews. And I did that for a few years, and then just a couple of years later, moved over to movies, covering movies, and then fairly quickly to editing. So when I came to the point of writing my first book, Pictures of a Revolution, which I started in 2004, it was at a time when I had spent the last more than 10 years being primarily an editor rather than a writer. And so I felt like I had a lot of writing trapped in me, like I'd missed my 30s as a writer and was very eager to make up for lost time.
Right, and all that, and editing means you're also reading a hell of a lot of other people's stuff. So there's that sense of okay, here I go. I've got to not prove myself necessarily, but yeah, I can only stand on the sidelines for so long.
Right, and I loved being an editor, and this was largely pre-internet, which meant that I was working with a staff of writers face to face in an office every day, really talking through stories with them and helping them rewrite, in some cases doing the rewriting myself and others. But it was very hands-on, face-to-face work, and I loved it. And I didn't miss writing while I was doing it, because I felt like I was very writing adjacent and getting to direct the movie coverage for a magazine at a time when that was just really fun, and magazines were not yet the sort of endangered species that the internet would soon make them. But I was ready by 2004 to try my hand in a book, I thought.
What was the move like from TV to film? Was that was that you following your own interests, or was that just the job that was available, or how did that move take place?
Well, it was the job that was available, but I had always been interested in both, and it was interesting to me that a lot of the entertainment journalists I met then, and still a lot that I meet now, you could be interested in movies and music, or you could be interested in TV, but those seem to be like two separate categories. I think now that the line has started to blur, and that we're having many more discussions about what is a movie, and that streaming services are, just changing the whole discussion, I think, about the difference between TV and movies. Like, I think they're very distinct things, but I also think that it's a really good thing that there's not a bright line between them in terms of coverage anymore. I don't think you can really understand what's going on in the movie business if you're completely ignorant about TV. And I don't think you can understand the changes in television if you don't know anything about the movie business and who owns what and what streaming means to movie studios. So I think it's good to be kind of ambidextrous about those things.
Yeah, I've noticed, I write occasionally for Sight and Sound, and I've noticed they're very much moving towards basically anything that appears on a screen we're going to have a look at and consider. They're definitely more, whereas in the past it would be, with the exceptions like a David Lynch, the Twin Peaks Return, or Fassbinder's Berlin Alexanderplatz or something like that. It seems to be much more welcoming.
Right, yeah.
So when it came to sitting down and doing your first book, it's a brilliant concept. It's a really good concept, the idea of looking at the 1968 Best Winners category in the Oscars. Are you someone who's are you attracted to the Oscars as a thing?
I am. I've always enjoyed covering them. I think they I mean, so much in movies and movie history is kind of transient that I really do love the idea of something that's existed almost for 100 years now and that provides a snapshot once a year of how the industry sees itself. I love its fallibility. I love its temporariness. I love that, I don't think it really, I'm not a person who hand wrings a lot about it doing a lot of harm, because I think in the long run, in the contest between the Oscars and a movie, the movie will always win. Nothing is really hurt by not winning an Oscar, although some movies I think have their reputations hurt considerably by winning an Oscar. But yeah, I like them as a cultural phenomenon, and I've always been interested in them as a window into something wider. And so I didn't want to write an Oscar book. And, when I started Pictures of a Revolution, I thought, well, there's a problem here in that, I can't build suspense out of something, the result of which anyone can Google and have in 2 minutes. But I do think that I can use these 5 movies, which I just felt strongly that I had a good idea with that particular combination of 5 movies. And that also, a couple of them, their origin stories started so early in 1963, basically, that I would be able to parade through the whole middle of the 60s in the course of telling these stories, which is something that I really wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a moment which is on the cusp of, going into new Hollywood with Arthur Penn and Bonnie and Clyde. But at the same time, you have sort of Dr. Dolittle and those films which are, and maybe even more so, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Is that the right title?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
For a second, I thought it might have been Look Who's Coming. No, that doesn't even grammatically run.
No, it's Guess Who's...
Which seems to be a throwback even technically to the sort of 40s in terms of thing. But you do, it is more complicated, the picture, than that, isn't it? Because as you say, with Bonnie and Clyde, that actually has long gestating as a project. It's not just the most happening now thing that's going on.
Right. I mean, one thing I really wanted to make clear about the making of movies is that even now, when we write about movies, we tend to talk about them as if they were conceived the day before we saw them. I mean, I saw this summer when In the Heights opened in the US, and it was widely described as a reopening movie, a movie about New York coming back to life. And of course, the pandemic was not only the furthest thing from anyone's mind when the musical was written, but the furthest thing from anyone's mind when the movie was shot. And in the mid-60s, that was particularly a kind of occupational hazard of making movies, because standards were changing so rapidly and mores were shifting so quickly that if you conceived something that felt very up to the minute in 1964 or 1965, and that was your goal, by 1967 or 1968, it could already feel old-fashioned and a little quaint. And I'm just fascinated by that. And by the futility, really, of trying to chase the moment if you're a movie maker. And so that was something I really wanted to write about in that first book.
I mean, one of the key roles there, or one of the key figures there, I think, is Sidney Poitier, in the sense that in the heat of the night, he feels he's really pushing into new ground, and then he sort of has to move straight on from that to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and play the kind of the noble black man who has no faults whatsoever.
Right, and he just dodges an even worse role in a third one of those movies, Dr. Dolittle, where he would really play an offensive stereotype. And I think Sidney Poitier's career, to me, is so moving. It's the thing I emotionally most connect to in Pictures of a Revolution, because to live this paradox of starting to be rejected as a relic of another age by your own people at precisely the moment that you become the biggest movie star in Hollywood is really heartbreaking to me. And it's a good reminder, and I think this has resonance with our era as well, that the judgment of the public can be very swift and very cruel, and also really fallible. There are certain kind of moviegoers who are very, very eager to discard something that they feel has outlived its usefulness, and often those are the most ardent and vocal movie fans. So it can really feel like it has the force of judgment. And I think that kind of glib discarding often does not hold up very well over time. I certainly don't think it held up well with Sidney Poitier.
Because there's this sense of there being an avant-garde in the audience, but then Stanley Kramer's making this movie for the whole of America, and he's very aware of what will play and what won't. Maybe too timid from our point of view, from our perspective, but looking at the perspective of those times, I think that's what the book does wonderfully. Is it couches it in that context, so you might not necessarily agree with the decisions, but you at least understand them.
Right. Well, with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, I think this relates to something that's very current as well, which is, how do you shift things? Do you shift things to the left by standing far to the left and pulling everything in your direction, or do you shift things by standing in the center and moving it 2 inches toward the left? That is, I think, what Stanley Kramer was doing. He thought he was a revolutionary pulling something left from the left. What he really was a mainstream American filmmaker, and the sort of revolutionary thing that Guess Who's Coming to Dinner did, even though I don't think it's a revolutionary movie, there's no question that it did have an effect on kind of mainstream, middle-of-the-road America. It was a huge hit that brought into people's field of vision something that a lot of them had not seen before, even when in certain cities and among certain generations, it already felt like old news.
Yeah, and then you get something like In the Heat of the Night, where you have Poitier hitting a white guy who in return for being hit himself. I should if someone hasn't seen the film, and there's that wonderful description of the San Francisco screening of everybody suddenly going really quiet, because it's like, we just haven't seen this before.
Sometimes I do screenings related to the book, and I still have so much fun showing that movie to people, because it's better technically in every way than they think it's going to be. They think they're going to end up watching an old late 1960s like TV police procedural, and then there are things like that moment in it that still jolt people in a really pleasurable way.
Yeah, absolutely. And they made a sequel that I never saw, which it was actually called They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, I think.
Yeah, there were a couple of sequels. There was that, and then he made one more. They're not very good, but what's interesting is it by the time he makes the first sequel, which is only, I think, 3 years later, we're already in a different era of Black movie stardom, which he kind of caused and then did not become a part of. I mean, by the last of the Mr. Tibbs movies, we're right on the edge of the blaxploitation era with things like Shaft and Superfly and Cotton Comes to Harlem. And that was a mode of movie making that Sidney Poitier was not interested in. And yet he was out of step with it, and yet he had also made it possible. It's really a fascinating career.
It's weird. It's like those rock and roll that first generation of rock and roll musicians who were like in their 30s when they suddenly found themselves sort of the golden oldies. They broken down the barriers, and then the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and Elvis Presley came along, and they were, well, even Elvis Presley to some extent was sort of like a nostalgic favorite, quite young.
Right. I mean, you don't get very old at all before you have to start looking over your shoulder to see who's right behind you.
And yet, despite the sort of controversial subject matter, or the delicate subject matter that these films were dealing with, the sort of most far out and weirdest film by far seems to be Dr. Dolittle, which is just a nuts, crazy, alcohol fueled excess.
Right. I mean, I always tell people, if they're reading the book, sometimes they'll say like, oh, and I really want to watch all 5 movies. You don't have to watch that one. It's actually more fun to read about, but the book doesn't work without it, because it's the rule to which everything else is an exception. It's the business that Hollywood studios thought they were supposed to be in. All of the other 4 movies I write about are kind of lower budget. The Graduate is actually an indie. They're off the sort of mainstream list of what the studios are doing that year. But Dr. Dolittle is the point of 20th Century Fox, and all of the ways in which it goes wrong, picking a release date before you've got a completed script, throwing good money after bad, figuring things out, about the script when you're on the set that you should have thought of months earlier. There's a lot of relevance to how movies are made now by studios that's packed into Dr. Dolittle.
And also hiring a star who's incredibly difficult on the back of a sort of slightly flukish late career hit.
Yeah, I mean, it's researching Rex Harrison was the only point when I was working on the book where I actually had to stop and say to myself, okay, everything I'm finding out about him is so terrible that I need to kind of hit pause and see if I can find some people who will give me the good side of him, who worked with him. I mean, this was 12 or 15 years ago when there were still a few people around who had worked with Rex Harrison. And so I called a bunch of people and they all said the same thing, which is, when are you writing about? Oh, 1967, no. Like if you were writing about the 40s or 50s, he was still human. But by the mid-1960s, he was just a monster. Right. So sometimes you just have to go with the consensus.
It's so weird as well that there's such a... I mean, I grew up watching Rex Harrison films and thinking here's a twinkly-eyed, avuncular figure who seems to be kindness and dignity under terrible circumstances or comedically crazy circumstances. But I was prepared because I read Richard Burton's diaries a few years ago, and he dishes the dirt on several times he goes out with Rex Harrison and his wife. I think when they were making Staircase, there was some terrible story. I mean, terrible, sort of hilarious because you don't have to be there stories.
I mean, alcohol is sort of a major character in the book, and is obviously responsible for a lot of what the problems were. The only thing I'll say in Rex Harrison's defense is that his extreme impatience with the way that movie was pulled together is understandable. I mean, he wasn't wrong to think this is an absolutely chaotic mess. What have I gotten myself into?
Yeah. I mean, do you think also that sort of Dr. Dolittle paradigm, it kind of gives the lie to the idea that these excesses of the new Hollywood people, the Apocalypse Now and the Heaven's Gate, were something that was tied into them being countercultural? I mean, the excesses were right there even when it was a studio picture, and it was,
That's a great point. I mean, the pharmaceuticals were different, but the idea of like ego and excess pulling a production out of control far precedes the advent of the new Hollywood. I think the big paradigm shift in the new Hollywood was of course that directors were given much freer reign, that they sort of became stars, and so a director could pull a production out of control in a way that wasn't as common before the mid-60s when there were tighter reins on. I mean, even in 1966, when Mike NIchols made Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, he was fired by Jack Warner out of the editing room in post-production. That even as late as 1966, when a director was sort of acting up too much, a studio could just absolutely pull the reins, and that really did change a lot in the new Hollywood era.
Yeah, I mean that's a good way of segueing into Mike NIchols, because of all the directors. I have a lot of time for Arthur Penn and a lot of respect for Norman Jewison, but Mike NIchols, you do get a feeling, is this sort of new idea of as you were sort of saying, the director is superstar at this point.
He came to Hollywood as one kind of superstar because he had this reputation both as a performer and as a real New York theater hit maker. So even before he ever directed a foot of film, he was absolutely a star in Hollywood. There may have been people there who were skeptical about whether he could switch mediums, but there was no one who was not impressed by his track record prior to his first movie.
Yeah, he's sort of almost got like there's an Orson Welles trajectory there a little bit, that he seems to be a star in 3 different ways before he even gets to Hollywood. You know, he's a comedy star with Elaine May, and he's on television. He's a massive theater success with her, and then the career as a director. Was the biography a sort of, did that come out of writing this earlier book? Was that where your interest was sparked?
No, it didn't really, although doing the first book contributed to it in a way. I mean, I met Mike around 2000 or 2001, before I had the idea to do the first book, because he was working on the HBO adaptation of Angels in America, which my husband wrote. So I got to know Mike socially that way. And then soon after Angels aired is when I came up with the idea for Pictures of a Revolution. And so then I started interviewing Mike and talking to him, and I started to get even more of a sense of what a fascinating career he had and what an interesting, thoughtful assessor of that career he was. But I concentrated incredibly hard on just The Graduate and the years immediately prior to it. I didn't get into anything else at all. We talked a little bit about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, because The Graduate was already underway while he was working on it, but only in that context. So when Pictures of a Revolution was published, which was 2008, I absolutely thought, oh, that's it. I'm done. Like, that's my take on Mike, and that's my take on Mike's most famous movie, and I'll move on to other things. And it did not occur to me to write a biography until shortly after he died, which was at the end of 2014, many years later.
And was that what was the sort of inciting incident in making that decision?
It was honestly my publisher's idea. I mean, they came to me and said, we know you have this connection and we know you've written about him. Would you be interested in this? And from a creative point of view, I felt, the two things. I had not thought of writing a biography of anyone. That it wasn't the kind of book that I had been thinking about. But as soon as they said it, I felt excited and scared, which are the two kind of laboratory conditions I need to do a book.
Plus caffeine, and no, you're away.
Right. But I just thought, honestly, what the impetus was realizing how little I knew about him. I thought I've never written about theater. I've never written about comedy. I've never written about Elaine May. I've never tried to write a life from beginning to end. There's so much that I don't understand about how his career came to be and how he made his decisions, that I thought I will never get tired of exploring this life and learning about it from the time during the time it will take to do the book. And I also thought I'll learn new things if I really do this book right. I'll learn things I don't know about how movies are made and how theater is made. And that was something I just really wanted to do. So that was kind of the spark for it.
Did you find there was any disadvantages to you knowing him, having a friendship, a relationship with him prior to writing the book?
I worried about it a lot, because I sort of worried about it in advance. I thought, when I'm doing my research, or God forbid, when I'm writing, am I going to feel like I have him over my shoulder, reading what I'm doing, commenting on what I'm doing, annotating what I'm doing? And I guess I think two things helped me. One is that from the time I signed the contract to write the book to the time I wrote the first page of the book, many years had gone by. So I had a lot of time to get used to it. And the other thing was, I didn't strictly research in chronological order, but I did absolutely start at the beginning of his life and his career, because of the urgency of doing interviews with, frankly, a dwindling number of people who were over 80, over 90, in some cases over 100. So the first long stretch of research was about Mike before I was born, like sometimes decades before I was born. And in the months that I was working on that, he just started to feel like a subject to me. He didn't feel like the person that I had known and had dinner with and had listened to tell stories. He felt like this person I had never met. and didn't understand and was trying to figure out. So I was kind of, the only times I would ever suddenly think like, oh my God, right, I knew him, were when I would hear his voice, when there'd be audio. But when I was doing the rest of the research, I just thought, this is my subject. And any kind of trepidation I had about, well, what if I find out something really terrible, or you know, am I going to constantly think like, would he like this in the book or out of the book? That just never arose. I guess there's a certain kind of ruthlessness that biographers have to have a little bit of. And I just kind of, I thought, I know the kind of books he was interested in. I know he liked truthful things. And I know that when I was working on Pictures of the Revolution, some of the very worst stories about Mike and his behavior, most of them, in fact, came from Mike.
Right.
So I used that just, probably self-servingly. I said to myself, I think he would want a truthful book. And I gave myself permission to write one.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely get that impression of him from the book, and from his own comments, that he is someone who himself would be ruthless in the pursuit of truth when it came to his direction. But yeah, he's quite cruel to Dustin Hoffman, isn't he, through the direction of that film?
Yeah, I think that's a really painful, complicated relationship because, of course, his decision to cast Dustin Hoffman was a huge act of faith. He was nobody, and he looked like nobody. He didn't look like a movie star. He didn't look like, Robert Redford, who wanted to be the star of that movie. And I think that there were moments when Mike was cruel. There were also moments when he was incredibly encouraging to Hoffman and really was able to kind of draw him out and get him in exactly the kind of head that he needed to get in. So it's interesting because Hoffman, when I interviewed him for The Graduate, said by the end of production on that movie, which was very long, I don't think anybody cared whether I lived or died. It was that rough on him. And yet it wasn't.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head to head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Like, he and Mike were not on the outs. They never worked together again, but they came close a number of times. And Hoffman later said he really regretted that they didn't work together again. And Mike, even toward the end of his life, would joke about, when he won a Lifetime Achievement Award at Lincoln Center, Mike got up and made a speech saying, where the hell is Dustin Hoffman? It's like not having the monster show up at a tribute to Frankenstein. So it was a challenging relationship. I think in many ways, it was a very affectionate relationship as well.
I mean, one of the best things you have with Mike NIchols, I think, as a subject, as a biographer, is the fact that he does give such good copy. I mean, he speaks in aphorisms. He's got an off-the-cuff way of talking, which most comedy writers would chop off 2 fingers to get.
Right, too good sometimes, because those perfectly turned phrases can sometimes represent the truth and sometimes disguise the truth. Mike really knew how to put up a wall that didn't look like a wall. He'd give you a beautiful quote that said nothing, but that you wouldn't be able to resist using. So I had to be careful about not always letting him have the last word, but at the same time, he's, as you said, wonderfully droll and articulate and has a really distinctive voice and I wanted his story in large part told by him because he tells it really well, and so it was more a question of like picking the quotes where I thought he was digging past kind of performative presentation to honesty and introspection, and he did that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that comes across very much. Speaking about his film career, of course, he swaps The Graduate for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf quite early on. The Graduate was supposed to be his first film, or maybe there was a couple of early attempts beforehand.
He had toyed with doing this play called The Public Eye as a movie, but yes, The Graduate was at one point going to be the first movie he did after The Public Eye fell apart, and then Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf sort of jumped the line, and there was a moment to do it right then, and so that. But yes, I think Mike always thought for a long stretch that The Graduate would be his first movie.
And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is an amazingly sort of confident debut, especially from a theatre director doing a theatre piece, a play, and yet he manages to render it cinematic without not necessarily doing anything gimmicky, but he's moving the camera a lot. He's, it's the opposite of a sort of filmed play.
It's amazing to me because I think Mike thought strategically a lot of the time, and I think he thought, I know how to do this. It's a play with 4 people. I've done a play with 4 people. It's a really limited location, so I don't have to learn how to shoot outdoors. And I think he thought this is very manageable as my first movie as a theater director. And yet what he ends up with is the 2 biggest movie stars in the world, one of whom has to have makeup to age her by 15 years, and the other of whom is struggling with a serious drinking problem, making a movie out of a script that is going to kind of destroy the production code and that they don't know how much they can get away with. And he has to learn how to make movies on the fly. I mean, and by his own admission, he knew just absolutely nothing technically about, anything from how do you shoot people coming through a door to what do different lenses mean to how do you know that you've gotten all the shots from all the angles of a scene that you'll need to cut it all together. And Mike was not, he could be high-handed, but he was really willing to learn and really eager to take help from people who he thought knew what they were doing, whether that was his editor, Sam Osteen, or Haskell Wexler, who shot Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, or Robert Surtees, who shot The Graduate, or Dick Silbert, who was a production designer, but could also keep the entirety of a movie in his head and its themes in his head while he was working on something. Mike really relied from his first movie on collaboration, and he really liked having other talented people in the room. So I think that was part of the key to his longevity.
Yeah, and he has such a run there with his first 2 films and also he does Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in black and white, but partly because of Elizabeth Taylor's makeup effects not looking good in color. And then with The Graduate, you have this sort of young film from, it's about youth, it's about young adulthood and that moment. Whereas the first one is about disappointed age, really, and, things going wrong. Although I guess the characters aren't as old as, old was a different age in the 1960s, I guess.
I think Richard Burton was always old, maybe.
Yeah, even when he was an angry young man, he was like a bit of a grumpy old guy as well. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to say he's one of my favorite actors from a child. I used to watch him on sort of, The Wild Geese and Where Eagles Dare, and he was my favorite sort of action hero sort of thing. Even though I think in those films he appears very little, actually. It's mostly a double playing him.
Yeah, there were times when he phoned it in, but there were a lot of times when he didn't. And I love watching him. I think his performance in Virginia Woolf is really like an all-time great. And to know what I didn't really know a lot about was how much of a problem the drinking was and how much he struggled with it even during the shoot. And that I find really moving, and that was something that Mike was always moved by. He had no tolerance for a certain kind of misbehavior, but he worked with a number of actors who had serious drinking problems. And he was in actors very sympathetic to it. He didn't see it as, I mean, he may have seen it as a kind of weakness, but it was a struggle, I think, that he was very moved by, and he wanted to help those actors just to get to the point where they could do what he needed them to do on camera. I mean, that was true of George C. Scott and Walter Matthau on stage, or Art Carney in The Odd Couple, who had was an alcoholic. I mean, he was, Mike was not an unsympathetic man.
Yeah, and of course later on he had his own problems with addiction in terms of his sort of use of cocaine. And I mean, I found there was a very rich irony, almost a comic irony, in him directing Postcards from the Edge. And basically they're all doing toots, and yet they're doing this film which is supposed to be about rehab. I mean, I even thought like the casting of Richard Dreyfuss as a doctor in that felt like a very large wink. I'm not sure if that would have been picked up at the time.
It's all really complicated. I mean, Mike had just come off of Working Girl, where he had dealt with Melanie Griffith having a cocaine and alcohol problem, and there's a kind of tough interaction between an actress and a director in Postcards that is very much based on that Working Girl experience. And yet at the same time, he's making Postcards from the Edge with Dennis Quaid, who's having his own drug problem at the time, and goes into rehab after the movie's done. So, it was something that was certainly hard to get away from in the mid and late 80s and early 90s. Ann Roth, who was his longtime costume designer, said to me really bluntly, you can't tell the story of Working Girl without cocaine. But a lot of people made the point that it wasn't, the big dividing line wasn't between people who did it and people who didn't. It was between people who had it under control, weekend users, and people who let it affect their work. That was the kind of class distinction on sets at that time, which is really extraordinary to think about.
Do you think that situation still pervades today, or do you think it's much tighter?
I think it's certainly like substance abuse problems haven't gone away, but I don't think things are nearly as freewheeling anymore. I mean, first of all, there's the culture of rehab is so pervasive that the idea is like, well, if you have a problem, why wouldn't you just go to rehab and deal with it? And also these giant budget studio movies, these immense franchise chapter behemoths. There's no room for that stuff. I mean, it's a little like Ned Beatty and Network saying, you can't meddle with the forces of commerce that way in a studio movie anymore. There's no economic time for you to have coke problem.
I mean, looking at his career, he never quite gets up to those heights that he got to with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and not in terms of cinema, maybe in terms of his plays and his television work. Do you think that's fair? Is that fair to say? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and The Graduate? I think it is fair. I mean, one thing, when I was working on the book, I always knew that in my head, I was always really excited to get to Catch-22, which is the movie that he makes right after The Graduate. Because first of all, I thought, oh, great, finally I can write past The Graduate, because I truly dreaded writing about The Graduate again. I thought, I don't know how I can write about this same movie twice, and won't it be exciting to get past that and tell more of the story. But also, Mike had a giant comedy career, not very long, but huge, 4 New York stage hits in a row with the first 4 plays that he directed, and then 2 huge back-to-back movie successes. And I thought, won't it be interesting to find out what happens when he comes to Earth? Not just when he has a flop, which Catch-22 was, but when he has to accommodate himself to a whole new rhythm of, like, you're a director, you're going to have successes, you're going to have failures, you're going to have a couple of big successes and a couple of things that are critically acclaimed but don't make a ton of money, and a couple of things that make a lot of money even though they have okay reviews. You're going to have a more normal career now. How do you process that? How do you, when you don't have your first failure until you're almost 40, and you have what turned out to be 40 years of your career still ahead of you, how do you function? What do you learn from failure? What do you learn from your ability to recover from failure? And I think one of the ways in which Mike's career was really exemplary was how well he handled that.
not all of his movies or plays were good. He had hot streaks and cold streaks, but he was, I think, remarkably undefensive about failure. I think Catch-22 showed him that he could have a big public flop and survive it and keep going. And right from that point, he goes from Catch-22 to Carnal Knowledge, a small scale movie that he does simply because he believes in the script and the writer and eventually the cast. And I think that sort of set him on a really interesting course. For the rest of his career, he said, this is what you do after you have a big failure. You should turn to something that you may have no commercial expectations for just because you love it. I've really been moved by the fact that as directors and as writers have read this book, which first of all, it really excites me that they're reading it. A lot of them have said that the failures are what mean the most to them, that what they really want to see, how through your 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s, you handle it when something that you've poured your heart into just doesn't work, and how you pick up and keep going. I think that is, for me, if the book has a lesson in it, it's that.
It's that sort of stamina and persistence to sort of bounce back.
Yeah, and honesty with yourself and ability to look at what went wrong and why, and try to course correct for the future. I mean, that's, whether you're in the movie business or not, that's a sort of good life approach.
Right, for everything. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to give the impression either that, following The Graduate, he made a ton of great movies after The Graduate as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, it would have been dismal if I had just been writing about 40 years of failure. I don't think I would have taken that on, or I would have ended the book a lot sooner.
Right. But I mean, there are those movies, even like Catch-22, which maybe didn't quite hit with the public for reasons that are not necessarily because of the movie itself, that I think the book really encourages people to go back and watch again with a different eye. I mean, I remember seeing Catch-22 I must have been like 14. I saw it on television, Channel 4 in England, and it just freaked me out so much. It's a war film that freaked me out. Several scenes that you describe in the book as well. So I knew it was considered sort of unsuccessful, especially from the point of view of this great novel that it wasn't able to sort of replicate on the screen. But it doesn't strike me as an unsuccessful film. It kind of does what it does.
I think that's a great point. I think of all of Mike's movies, it's the one that's right on the line. And it was even right on the line for him. I mean, he alternated between saying, nope, we did it wrong, we tried and we failed, with, especially later in his life, saying, there are actually things I really like about that movie. And I understand the ways in which it got away from me, but I think it has some valuable things in it. And I completely agree with that. Like, I think it's a really interesting movie. I get why it was a flop, and I get why it was wrong for its moment, but there's nothing about it that is thoughtless or heedless or unconsidered. You can see that it's a movie made by people who intelligently wrestled with this monster of a novel and tried to figure out a way to bring it to the screen.
Yeah, I think I read on Twitter one of your tweets talking about Heartburn as one of the films that you would like to, if everybody sort of goes and rewatches Heartburn or watches it for the first time, that's the, your work is done.
I love Heartburn, and I've tweeted that a couple of times. And what's really fun to me is probably about 7 out of 10 people will come back to me and say, "Oh my God, that was fantastic! Why did I never see this? This Meryl Streep performance is just great. There are all these brilliant little moments in it." And the other 3 people will come back and say, "Well, that was shit." Like, there are people like I will not persuade at all, and I like a divisive movie, and it still is there. I think the reason I keep telling people about Heartburn is because I think of all of the movies that Mike made that didn't get good reviews, that one, the bad reviews for that movie were the most motivated by things that had nothing to do with the movie, by this weird fixation of the time on the Nora Ephron, Carl Bernstein divorce and all the publicity that had gotten, and also by a kind of problematic belief on the part of a lot of male critics that Mike had sort of given himself a demotion in the 1980s by deciding to become a director of women's pictures. Like, there's a lot of weird gendered stuff in those Heartburn reviews that has not aged well. So I do think it's the movie that most deserves a fresh critical look, maybe, of that and Catch-22, I think are the movies that I'd love to see critics kind of tackle again.
Not the Gary Shandling movie, then. That's not getting a...
You know, I mean, I talked to a bunch of people who were in the Gary Shandling movie and who worked on it. Nobody was willing to say, no, it's really great, it's just misunderstood. I mean, it just didn't work. Annette Bening said really interestingly, it got too big for itself, that we had always imagined it as a sort of, when you think about what was being made in the late 90s, things like Being John Malkovich, for instance, they thought of it as that size a movie. And the strange thing is, I think it's the movie that Mike got the most money for of anything he ever made, something like $8 million. And the minute you get a salary like that, everybody else's salaries go up, and suddenly you're making a very big movie that needs to be big in order to justify all those salaries. And I don't know if it ever could have worked or not, but the scale on which that movie was made was just not a good thing for it.
Yeah, it's just not appropriate it's a sort of a small sort of indie comedy idea.
Right, it's a sort of silly, dirty joke / romance. It should feel casual and a little grubby and tossed off, maybe.
I mean, the funny thing is, isn't it? I watched the Gary Shandling documentary that came out recently, and you sort of see it from the different angle of Shandling's point of view there. And it seems that Nichols is someone who had to have a relationship with his star, so he would have these collaborations with Meryl Streep and with Jack Nicholson, and as you said, with Dustin Hoffman, that very even slightly ambiguous relationship, but it was a relationship. And you get the feeling with Gary Shandling that relationship just wasn't there.
Right. I think that there were a couple of times late in his career when Mike said that the mistake he essentially made was casting someone only off of their work without meeting them first, and then he gets face to face with them, whether it's Gary Shandling or Morgan Freeman and Frances McDormand, who he put on stage in a Broadway revival of this play called The Country Girl. Sometimes, like, if the chemistry isn't there, I think Mike found that exceptionally hard. Another instance of that is the Robert De Niro movie that he never finished, Bogart Slayer, when he really didn't spend any time with De Niro. And De Niro said to me about that movie, if I were doing it now, if I had known then what I know now, I would have said, let's all sit down together and do a reading of this script first and see if it works and see if we're right together and see if I'm right for it. But they didn't do that then. And I do think that because Mike was such an actor-connected director, and that relationship was so primary to him and so important, when it wasn't there, he could really feel at sea.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't even know how to talk to this guy. We're not talking the same language.
Right, and he could talk to a lot of different actors. It's not like he directed them all the same way. The range of people he got great performances out of is extraordinary. I mean, and as varied as Richard Burton and Philip Seymour Hoffman and Julia Roberts and Natalie Portman, but when it wasn't there, it really wasn't there. And he almost felt like all of his tools had been taken away.
Yeah. I mean, that's the amazing thing of looking at that run of films and seeing how many great collaborators he made, sort of like Emma Thompson in Angels in America, and who sort of become very close friends. I mean, even Gene Hackman, he fires him from The Graduate, and then he casts him in Postcards from the Edge, and sort of has and The Birdcage,
right?
Has these strong relationships with them.
Yeah, it's well, Mike, when he fired an actor, often did not fire the actor because he thought he was a bad actor. There were all kinds of reasons for it, but yeah, those collaborations, I mean, and a lot of them did become lifelong friendships. That was really key. And I think one reason I was really interested in writing the life of Mike as a director was that he's a great counterexample to the way we think of directors a lot today. I mean, I think there's a prevailing idea still, this auteurist thing, that a director is someone who has to sail the ship of his vision through everybody who is in the way of that vision, from the screenwriter who doesn't get it, to the actors who don't get it, to the studio who doesn't get it. You have to steer that ship into port. And Mike's approach, I mean, Mike was very strong-minded and did have a picture of what he wanted his movies to be in his head, but he was also intensely a believer in collaboration, a believer that a director's job is to bring the best out of his actors, to bring the best out of his writers, his cinematographers, and to let them elevate him. And I do think that that's a legitimate, important way of being a director that is very often undervalued or under discussed in contemporary film discourse.
Yeah, it's that thing of like the putting aside the ego, and it's a weird combination of sort of I'm the director and sort of attempting to efface yourself and your role to some degree.
Right, and Mike was not a man of small ego. I mean, he was absolutely the guy in charge on sets. But I think part of this comes from being a performer, who rose to success as part of a duo where you had to carry the other person and let them carry you because you were in it together. And part of it comes from being a theater director, where the writer, at least in New York theater, the writer really is the boss. I mean, a playwright having a Broadway production done can fire the director at any point. The director can't fire the writer. So
sounds like heaven.
It probably depends on whether you talk to directors or writers, but
I'm coming from a writer's point of view.
In a way, I think it's not the worst training for a film director to be a little bit humble, or to understand how valuable collaboration is.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. The Mike NIchols biography was your third book, I think, because you did the
Five Came Back, yeah.
Five Came Back, which was also made into a big Netflix documentary series, which is amazing. Have you got plans for another book already gestating? Is there anything you can tell us about that?
I wish I could tell you more than I can tell you, but what I can tell you is yes, I have just in the last month gotten to the point where this idea that been working on for a while has finally come together, and I'm about to sign a contract to do it. And what else can I tell you? It's not like any of my first three books, and it's not another biography.
Okay. Oh, brilliant. Well, okay. One last thing before we finish. What film book would you recommend? It can be any choice. What film book would you recommend to our listeners?
I am going to recommend one that is not out yet, but is coming out in the next month or so. It's this fantastic new book called Fun City Cinema by a writer named Jason Bailey. And what it is essentially like 100-year history of New York movies, but also 100-year history of all of the considerations that went into making movies in New York, and sort of New York's emergence and evolution as a city that could accommodate itself to film. So I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I learned a ton about New York from this book that I didn't know, and a ton about the specific movies that Jason writes about. He also gives you, for each chapter, a kind of great viewing guide. So among other things, this is a fantastic watch along book. Like you will emerge from it with a really extraordinary list of all different kinds of movies to watch. And it's a lovely, smart, new approach. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, brilliant. I came to New York for the first time like a few years ago, for the first and only time up until now. And I just think it's so amazing when you go to a city that you've seen so many times in the movies, shown in so many different ways, and you're actually there and you suddenly go, oh, wait a minute. Okay, so that bridge is over there. And this, you sort of work out the topography and the geography of it. And then when you go home, you watch all these movies with a totally fresh eye,
Right, and you'll see a lot of movies where the car rounds the corner and suddenly they're actually 2 miles away, I see that all the time. But yeah, I mean, you can't really walk around New York almost without crossing a street where something has been filmed at some point.
I work in Venice, and so I actually remember going to see The Tourist, which was filmed in Venice. And they do things like they move the airport so it's opposite the St. Mark's Square. So there's just loads of ridiculous geography that goes on there. And I think in the Casino Royale, he runs across St. Mark's, but he's running from and to the same corner. They've just obviously cordoned off one corner and then dress it differently. But if you know this, just like that, he's just running backwards and forwards to this same corner.
There's a pretty good tradition of Venice movies, though. I mean, there's a lot to choose from there. I mean, like instantly think of Don't Look Now.
Don't Look Now is right near where I teach. The old church Donald Sutherland is restoring, which is kind of one of the oldest and kind of not ugliest churches, but for Venice, it's the most sort of crumbly, falling down sort of thing. It's not. I think that's what's brilliant about that movie, and in fact quite unique, is it shows Venice in a very sort of dirty, scruffy city. It doesn't show it as just the postcard with the gondola rides and the this and the that, So,
I haven't been to Venice, but I feel like when I do go, Don't Look Now is what I will most expect it to look like based on the movies that I've seen.
Yeah, it does not disappoint. Well, if you ever do come, I will give you the guided tour.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for giving us your time, and best of luck with your new project.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me on. This was really fun.
So that was my conversation with Mark Harris. His new book, Mike NIchols, the biography, is available from everywhere you can buy quality books. Likewise, pictures from the Revolution or scenes from the Revolution, depending on whether you're getting the UK or the US edition. His recommended book was Jason Bailey's upcoming book, Fun City Cinema, a book about New York films. Thanks go to Elliot Atkins for the music and Elliot Harwood for the artwork, and also to you for listening. Take care.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.